The Hendy Amps Michelangelo XL EQ has arrived. Now in this video, what I wanted to do was just show you what it's capable of in terms of the curves. I want to show you in Plugin Doctor all the curves it can create and what it is, and get people to understand the concept of why we created this product. And the reason being is because whenever we're using saturation or EQ, we always want to push a little bit more. The problem you've got with, let's say you're pushing into a tube and you're really driving a tube, is you kind of go, right, I can go there, I can't go any further, and then you kind of dial back a little bit. The concept behind this version is that what we want to be able to do is go the full distance, go as hard as we want into that tube, for instance, and then dial it back and pull back with another EQ that's parallel to it. So what Chris has done with this box is strapped two Michelangelo EQs together. One's a tube EQ, one's the MOSFET EQ. So the top one's the tube, bottom one's the MOSFET. What you're able to do with this, and this is the whole concept behind it, is that we wanted to be able to push that Michelangelo tube EQ and then use the MOSFET to pull back, or vice versa. Push the MOSFET, get a more saturated sound, and then use a very clean tube EQ to pull it back. The reason behind this is, and I'm going to explain this all in the video, and I'm going to show you in Plugin Doctor exactly what the curves are doing and how it's all working, is basically, let's say for argument's sake, we look at the top end, we look at the higher band. If we increase the kind of the amount of gain in the high band, what I wanted to do was basically increase that gain. Now that gain's too much, there's too much there, but what I want to go a bit further. I want to go as far as I possibly can, get that tube to really kind of sweet sound out the tube. Then using the MOSFET EQ, I want to pull back, I want to dial it back. So then what we're doing is we're increasing the gain in that high band, and then we're using the MOSFET EQ to bring it back level. And the difference is quite honestly incredible, and I did not expect it to sound this good. So the first example what I'm going to show you, before I show you what the curves can do, I want to show you the difference that it makes in terms of if we were to just have the Michelangelo EQ, how it sounds with just the Michelangelo EQ on its own, and then the difference it makes by adding this MOSFET version underneath and having the two parallel together. So let's jump in and I'll show you just how good this thing sounds. So as you can see here, we have a setting set up for the drums, and if you look at Plugin Doctor now, you'll see that it's quite level. There's no real massive gain increases in any of the bands, but you'll see there's a lot of kind of tone shaping and EQ going on there. And obviously what we're doing is whatever we're doing here, we're compensating and attenuating using the MOSFET EQ. So what I can do is I can turn the trim down on the MOSFET, and you'll see on Plugin Doctor exactly what the tube EQ would look like if we didn't have this. So if that was the EQ curve that we were using with just the tube EQ, we'd have too much low end, we'd have maybe too much high end. And what we're able to do when we blend in the MOSFET is, instead of just increasing the gain, we're increasing the amount of saturation in the track without increasing the gain. And this is the whole concept behind why we built this and why this is such a unique EQ. So if I just show you again, that is the curve with the MOSFET out, and then how we can bring it back in nice and level using the MOSFET EQ. So now what I'll do is I'll play the two versions. So the version with the tube EQ active only, and then I'll play the version with the MOSFET introduced. So the way I've designed this is to be able to drive that tube section, let's go all the way to the top, and then be able to use the MOSFET to be able to pull it back and attenuate that. So what we've then left with is we can even out that curve. So what this usually would mean is, let's say we're going to 8 on here and bringing this all the way down. Now we've got relatively level curve there. But what would normally happen is if you didn't have this MOSFET below, this would be your curve. And you would notice a substantial amount of gain increase in the top end. But using the MOSFET, you can see we can bring it back level. So we're still getting that sound of hitting the tubes and driving those tubes in the top end, but we're now able to attenuate it. What you have on the high band is this switch from smooth to sharp, and you can switch where the frequency slope starts from. So what this means is, using that method of dialing it back in, you can also change the curves how you want them and be able to create some really nice curves. See, you've got a little bit more of a dip there. Sharp brings it nice and level. We can almost get pretty much level there. Now, again, if we didn't have this section, we put that back. You see now we've got that big gain increase. So we're still getting that lovely saturated top end that we wanted to add by driving that tube. But by doing this and compensating for it, what we're now able to do is keep the level as it was. What you also have on the high band is you've got the high cut, which, as you can see, we can roll off some of that top end. So what this is good for is, if we're using the airband, if we push some airband in, if we really push it in with both the MOSFET and the tube, we can then pull it back using the high cut and tame it down a bit, but we're still getting that real nice push into that airband. So without the high cut, you're looking like that. With the high cut, you can bring it back nice and level. Get a nice sweet spot, let's say around there. The concept behind this EQ is to have the ability to drive the tubes, to drive the MOSFET, to add that saturation, but without increasing the overall gain of the track. So instead of a track adding saturation and the track getting louder, what you're actually obtaining is the track is getting fuller rather than getting louder in the bands that you're working with. So if we now look at the low end, put some low end in. Now we can switch this to 80 Hertz or 150 Hertz. And then what we can do with the low end is create what is essentially Pultec style EQ with it. We can then switch the MOSFET to 80, 120. And we could start creating some real nice curves with that. And this sounds, it's the low end on this sounds unbelievable. So you can see here, if we play with the EQ in the low end, you can almost see that we can bring it back level without increasing too much of the gain. We're adding saturation without adding too much in the way of volume to that band. And similarly for the mid-range, we can add some mid-range in, and then we can pull it back. See how we can pull it back pretty much level and flat again? So again, what we're doing is we're basically adding saturation in the tubes and then attenuating it via the MOSFET. And you could do that vice versa. You can use the tube to attenuate, add more saturation, so you're getting a lot of kind of, the MOSFET sounds a lot harsher, it sounds a lot more saturated, the tube sounds a bit more cleaner. And that's why we chose two different styles of EQ. And then you can use the tube and you'll create all sorts of different curves. Then we have the vintage switch. So if we switch to vintage, you'll see the curves change. I prefer to use it for more modern music. I like to use it with the vintage off, but it's a nice option to have. There's certain tracks. I did a orchestral track the other day that sounded really nice, because what you can do is you can, have it in vintage and then really push the top end, bring the top end back in. You also have the aggression, which basically pushes more input into the tubes, or you can push more input into the MOSFET. And you'll notice that the more you push in, like, you can get a balance between them. You can see how much the curves change. So you also have here full and flat, and you'll notice how the curve in the mid-range changes more towards the low end. So if you need to add some more weight into the kick, but from the mids, that's a really nice way of doing it. Add some weight into a snare as well. And that's the same with the tube one. So you can see there, add a lot more into the low end. This is a really cool feature. We have the trim, which isn't just output gain for the tube section and the MOSFET section. It's an actual mix and a blend. So we can hear, you can take out altogether what the MOSFET is doing. So that is the EQ curve, just using that's the EQ curve just using the tubes. And then that is the EQ curve just using the MOSFET. And that's good, because what you can do is you can go, right, I just want to use the Michelangelo tube EQ, and you can just use it like this as a nice Michelangelo standard Michelangelo tube EQ. Or you can go, right, I want to use just as a MOSFET,